Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Really excited about Game Day at Unitize 2020. Have a great group of people that came together to figure out how blockchain can transform the gaming industry and create systems that provide more equity for more people around the world across the 2.5 billion people that play games every day today, and create more economic opportunity and systems that pull more people in and hopefully align developers and players more and more, as you just saw in the video on community economics that we walked through. We have a great group of speakers today, including folks from Dapper Labs, who are the creators of the Flow blockchain, which is designed specifically for games and applications like games, as well as the creators of CryptoKitties. We have folks from Engine, who are the creators of the ERC 1155 standard on the Ethereum blockchain, and they have a rich platform and set of tools for game development. We have Immutable Labs, who are the creators of one of the leading blockchain games today in Gods Unchained, and they also have a gaming platform. We have other speakers like the folks from Starkware, who are some of the leaders in the world in figuring out scalability for mass market applications on blockchain like games. And I'm really excited to introduce Kathy Barrera, who is a founding partner at Prism Group. Kathy and Prism have done phenomenal work in economics, and today we'll have a conversation about what game economies really could look like in the future as they start to embrace blockchain and introduce more economic ownership for players and more market systems and economies inside of games. So Kathy, thank you for joining today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Really excited to talk. I thought I could kick off quickly to just talk about a little bit about the game industry, and then we can talk about the transformations we think might be happening as these new economic systems get introduced. Games have been around for about 50 years now as an industry, and they started from a really niche activity at the beginning to now a truly mass market phenomenon that's nearly ubiquitous, where almost everyone in the world who has a computing device of any kind, or an internet connection plays games. Again, there's about 2.5 billion people that play games every day now. It's, as we heard in the video, over $160 billion a year revenue industry today. And so that's kind of the business side of it. But to me, what's really compelling and cool about games is they're just really fun. They're these really rich experiences. They're very immersive. They're ways to connect with people from all over the world and just have fun playing together. And games are also challenging, and they're systems where you learn and develop skills and try to overcome big challenges. And so because they're so interconnected and there's such strong communities in games, they just feel like a natural place for new economic systems to be created. And games have gone through different evolutions with business models. And so we thought today, we could talk about what might happen as market economies are introduced in games and the economies start to expand. And I thought, Kathy, maybe you could describe generally, what we see when new economies and more market mechanisms are introduced into systems that exist.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought that it was funny that in the video you used the example of sort of the movement from feudal society to something that's starting to look a little bit more industrial. And so I think, the first thing that I would just point out is that there's a couple channels or mechanisms by which an economy can grow as a result of sort of introducing more property rights or introducing more market type mechanisms. And those two channels are really, the one is innovation and sort of the creation of new products or investment in growing the value of sort of things that already exist in the economy. So if you think about if you think about property rights as sort of being the difference between, like renting an apartment versus owning a property, usually people who own a property are more likely to put more value into the property that they own. So that's one mechanism. And then the other mechanism is by creating new allocations in the economy. So sort of as we introduce a market, we might increase competition for selling goods and services, things like this. That might make more goods and services available in the market and make those things more accessible to the demand side, to consumers or players in a game who want to access that market. And so I think both of those have the potential to apply in the context of games and game economies.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's part of what excites me about, this forthcoming change that we see, and certainly at Forte that we're trying to work on, is, players today already care about the games they play so much, and a lot of times they do invest a great deal of time and money, but also effort and creativity into games, and it's been really interesting to see over the last 20 years or so as games have moved online and these rich communities have been created. It's been really interesting to see how players actually contribute to the games that they play and love. In gaming, there are these things called mods or modifications, which are basically player created additions to an existing game. And the mod scene sort of started off small, but now it's a big part of the industry. And some of the top games in the world, like League of Legends or Counter Strike Go or Defense of the Ancients, were basically player created initially. And so what's really interesting to me to think about is, as we simultaneously see players are starting to earn income kind of on the periphery of games through streaming or through esports and essentially being pro players, it's interesting to think about, what happens when the ability to earn income and to have property rights and to create marketplaces and commerce between players comes into the game. And a way we might see that manifest is, when a player creates a modification to a game and enhances the gameplay, they might be able to earn income directly when more players play that modification. And maybe the original developer of the game that the mod is based on could take a share of that revenue as well. So exactly in line with what you're saying, I think as players have more economic agency, as they have more property rights, as these systems come to the fore inside of games, I think players will invest even more time and even more of their creativity into these games, and hopefully we can create systems that just create more economic opportunity all around. But it's not going to be simple. To get there, there's a lot of complex challenges to figure out. And Kathy, you and Prism Group have done some phenomenal work in these areas, and I'm just wondering if you could walk through your perspective on, what sorts of challenges an industry faces when it starts to think about, new business models, new economic models, and the introductions of market-based systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the idea, not just in terms of a specific industry, but in general in national economies of driving growth, is that sort of when we can get more investment, when we can get more innovation, that creates sort of more value for everyone, more value to go around, and the rising tide raises all boats. And I think that's possible, but it doesn't always happen that way.
Right.
And so one thing that we really want to look out for is, how is this new value that we're going to create going to be distributed, and is it really going to be the case that everyone benefits, or are some folks perhaps going to benefit more than others? And in particular, it's really important to think through that issue, because if you need to bring on all of these different participants, players, developers, in order to get to that new way of doing things, then you need to make sure that all of those folks who you need to bring to the table will benefit from change. So I think that the biggest challenges I see are that it's not clear off the bat whether all developers would benefit from this. I think that very much depends on exactly how these changes unfold, and in particular, it could be, for example, that newcomer developers benefit more than sort of the old guard. So that's one big issue to consider. And then the second place where I would look for differences among these different participants is within the category of gamers, of people who are playing the game. So you see a lot of difference between, and I'm sure you could speak and give us some more details and statistics, but you see a lot of difference between sort of people who are more dedicated players versus people who are casually playing these games. And the introduction of these mechanisms might impact those different groups differently,
Right.
which we would directly care about, but it could also impact the feel of the game and how gameplay works if we're sort of having these differences.
Totally right. Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of really important points that ourselves, I think others in the industry and developers that start to think about these systems really need to bear in mind, which is how do you intentionally design for the sorts of the sorts of economies that you want to create, and what are the challenges there? And I think you walk through a really interesting example of sort of how might developers embrace this type of change. And what we've seen in the game industry in the past is there have been massive revolutions and transformations of the business model of games, the distribution of games, the types of games that are popular. And the most recent example of this was the move to free-to-play games, which we talked a little bit about in the video. And in those games, a really problematic dynamic occurs. The design challenges we discussed in that video is that you end up with these free to play games that are free to access, but only a small percentage of players pay. And so, how do you design a game where the people who pay sometimes tremendous amounts of money, aren't just overpowered and don't have overwhelming advantage against players that simply can't pay or wouldn't want to. And so it's really challenging incentive structure today with game developers and game players, where game developers essentially want to and need to cater to their biggest spenders. And that risks kind of leaving the people that can't pay behind. And what's exciting about the possibility of these new systems is that maybe the people who play the game the most but can't pay, but can't afford to purchase goods in the game, could actually start to earn income from these games by being expert or by spending time in the game and having other players pay them for their services or for their expertise, or purchase the goods that the players have bought from, have discovered in the game. And to me, that's really exciting to think about. But it gets to the question of, how will developers embrace this, and really what do they need to think about when it comes to economic systems? And again, you guys have done great work in thinking about things like, what does ownership of assets really mean? What are property rights? What are the claims that an individual might have on a good versus the true underlying residual control of the goods? And how can developers start to think about all these trade-offs? And so I'd love for you to talk about your view of property rights and what that means in economic terms.
Absolutely, yeah. So I sort of alluded a little bit earlier to one aspect of owner in talking about sort of the difference between renting versus owning something like a home, which I think can apply equally well to maybe in-game assets.
Mm-hmm.
And the key here is, it's not just about that you have access to the value of that asset, but that you actually control the asset itself, which allows you then to sort of capture or visions about how to deal with modifications or investments that you make in that asset. And so it's really those control rights that then create the incentive to make these kinds of investments. And those can be separated from claim rights, which is access to the value of the asset. And so in a game, we design the market or design the assets in a way that allows folks, players, to tap into the value of the assets that they have in the game or that they're using, but not give them control rights.
Mm-hmm.
Or on the other hand, we could decide to go that further step and also give them control rights. And that might look different. And that might incorporate something like being able to port your asset from one game to another. And so I think that there is different levers that these developers are going to have available to them when deciding what these new markets are going to look like.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we start to see the beginnings of this in some places in games, and I think it's important to understand too that related to your earlier point, there's not necessarily a binary sort of cutoff, like where you introduce the idea of property rights to players or market economies in a game and just wholesale change every aspect of your game. There are thriving games, today with millions of players that love them, and they have thriving businesses for the developers that create them too. And one of the things we're excited about is seeing developers look at ways they can start to introduce property rights and market mechanisms, community economics in an incremental way, even inside existing games. So rather than taking a game that already has an audience of players that loves it and is a healthy business for the game developers themselves, how could they introduce new assets into a game that players have more property rights with, have more claims on the value of, and have more control over, and introduce fun mechanics inside of games to do that. And we're starting to see that happen already today. It's really exciting, and it's also a trend in the industry. We talked a little bit about players starting to earn income through their play, kind of on the periphery of the games industry. But if you look at the few examples of games that introduce even the beginnings of market mechanisms into games and the ability for players to trade, for example, there's some really compelling examples about how big the economic activity could be, how transformative it could be for the industry. So there's a game called Counter-Strike Go, which again was started off as a mod of another game. It started off as a mod of a game called Half-Life. And in Counter-Strike Go, which is the current version of this game, it's a free-to-play game, and players can purchase these skins. They're like cosmetics in the game, so you can dress your character in different ways. And in Counter-Strike, you can trade in players. And Counter-Strike, has been around for a long time. It's been out for over 10 years. It's still a massive game. It's one of the top esports games. Um, but in that game, it does about, depending on the year, $200 to $300 million a year in direct revenue. So purchases of goods from the players to the developer. But in the trading economy, the trading marketplace on top of it, again, depending on the year, there's $2 to $5 billion, so an order of magnitude more gross merchandise value, essentially gross revenue that flows through the economy as players trade. And so I think it indicates, what's possible when you even start to introduce these mechanisms inside a game economies, and even in an incremental ways, as you discussed, Kathy, and giving people just a little bit more ownership, a little bit more access to value, and getting hopefully developers and players a little bit more aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that there's a lot to build on in the direction that the industry is moving. And I would love to hear from you sort of um, where would you like to see this end up? What further innovation do you think is the industry in need of right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for me, what's so exciting about the possibility of this space, certainly, what we're working on and what I'm starting to see from developers in the industry, is basically tackling this design challenge that we talked about in that video, which is really, how do you take the current version of gaming, which is wonderful in many ways. Again, billions of people play. Players have a lot of fun. They challenge themselves. You connect with people worldwide. Games are just cool, I think. But the big challenge with them is because they're free to play. Like the benefit of that is they're open to access. But you have this business model where developers are really dependent on a very small percentage of players that drive almost all the revenue in the game. In a typical a top free to play game, it's typically less than 1% of the player base drives 80% or more of the total revenue for the game. So you just think about how squarely focused developers have to be on those people that can spend just massive amounts of money inside the game. And a typical player in that top percentage of spenders will spend tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars in the game. So what's exciting to me about working on all this stuff is how can we create systems that have the benefits of free to play, where anyone can access the game and you can jump in and have fun. You can connect with people from anywhere in the world, make friends and pull your friends in. Just have a great time challenging yourself in a game. but have a better, business model where a developer, could still sell goods to players, and there might be some big spenders, who purchase goods directly from the developer. But can you create a peer-to-peer economy? Can you create an economic system where players can help each other? And again, where, if I'm a player who maybe just doesn't have, I love the game, but I don't have a lot of time to play, and I don't have all the best items or most powerful gear in the game, maybe I could purchase those items from another player, or I could pay a player to, guide me through a more challenging, dungeon or experience in the game. And that could benefit the player who, maybe can't make purchases inside of the game, but now could actually earn income from the game. And so just working on those systems and figuring out, exactly as you said, how to design them so that developers benefit and players benefit as much as possible is what's so exciting to me, and part of why it's thrilling to work with you and others who have thought so much about these economic challenges in general, and now the opportunity to bring them potentially to billions of people around the world is just really cool. And I guess if we think about the situation we were just recently in and still are in the world where people were at home and there was hundreds of millions of job losses around the world. If we could wave a magic wand and transform the industry, so that these market systems existed as of a few months ago, people might have been able to be at home and play games and engage in these market systems and potentially earned income, from home. So I just think it's such a compelling way to think about the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you paint a really vivid picture of what things could look like, and
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important when when an industry is ripe for disruption, and for the folks who are participating in that innovation and that disruption to have sort of a clear idea of where they would like to be able to get.
Mm-hmm.
And in economics, we think about layering the design that can help us achieve that together with that vision. By so I use we use this concept in economics called first best, second best. So the first best is that ideal. It's if I could make sure that these people are cooperating and this sort of innovation is getting developed and this investment is being made, then we will achieve this amazing vision.
Right.
And the second best is what you can actually achieve, given that everyone who's participated is just going to do whatever works best for them
Mm-hmm.
in that system, and you guide the outcome from where we currently are to the second best by designing good mechanisms that will support that outcome. And so I think, again, it's really important to start with that big vision. And then we can sort of come back a little bit and think more precisely about, okay, where can we practically get from where we are today in the direction of where we're trying to go, and what specific mechanisms, what economic design, because we're building a new market, what economic design do we need in order to achieve that achievable outcome? And I
Yeah.
think that just to go back to the an issue that you brought up earlier, there's lots of work that has been done on designing these new kinds of marketplaces, designing these new kinds of economies in the tech industry in the last couple of decades, within the blockchain space over the past few years. That's something that we at Prism Group have been working very hard on. And I think that a lot of the lessons that have been learned in those areas can be ported over to games in order to try to make these advancements. And we've talked a little bit about the design of property rights, but there are sort of other areas too, market design, incentive design, that should certainly be incorporated in this big push.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, because there's so much to think about and because it can be so complicated, as we discussed earlier, I think one of the best ways developers can proceed is to think about, small chunks of changes that they can make in their game and how they can start to introduce, again, a class of assets that players own, and start to get these systems to work, and then really learn from players, learn from what they see, track the metrics and information, inside of games, which developers are already pretty sophisticated about, and really start to measure what's happening and try to create more and more benefit for players so that players stick around in the games longer, they have more fun, they pull more friends in, and ultimately, hopefully create a bigger economy as these sorts of systems introduce. But you really have to think deeply about this stuff, and in some ways that can be intimidating. So it's also good to realize that there's ways to introduce it incrementally and gradually, even into existing games.
Yeah, I think that's super important, and it also so you can start small with something that's quickly implementable, which is nice, and then it's also very important to have that opportunity to collect data. So you're experimenting, you're seeing what works and what the impacts are, and then you can make adjustments before you roll out something bigger, and that's really in line with the process of economic design that's used in practical microeconomics. We've seen that in play in the tech industry at places like eBay and Uber. We've seen it in spectrum auction design, et cetera. But you really start with building on decades of research in economics and economic theory to form some hypotheses, to create nice, crisp experiments of what you think is going to work, and then you sort of run these, incorporate these smaller, confined experiments in a practical setting, learn from them, and then iterate from there. And so I think that that process that's already being employed is the right one.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And that's not to say you couldn't just go for it whole hog. Like some developers, I think some game studios will, just embrace this and just create new games that are from the ground up designed to, embrace player economies and community economies, and that'll be really fun to see too. But it's good to know that, even in an existing game, you can start to experiment with this, and start to really learn how it works and can benefit your players and yourself as a developer. And it's an important issue in the game industry because we already see players engaging in secondary markets and even gray markets and trading with each other outside of games. Of almost every major successful game essentially has an economy, a peer-to-peer economy, a player-to-player economy, kind of around the game. It's just not embraced because of it's so complex to figure out these issues. And it's one of the things that blockchain can really help solve for game developers is the security around the ownership of these assets and the transactions that need to take place with developers. As developers think about these incentive systems, how can they enshrine them, in a way that players can understand them and trust that, the incentives really are, what the developer claims that they are. And that's again where blockchains and smart contracts can help. And I think, Kathy, as we close out in the last couple minutes here, I just want to thank you again for joining. And if you have any parting thoughts about the types of economic systems that developers should think about, I think it will help point game developers to the sorts of things they should start to research and potentially work with folks like you and Prism on.
Absolutely. So I think that the last point you made is actually a super important one. And we have seen throughout history that markets do arise spontaneously. So things like black or gray markets will pop up just because people want to participate in them. But markets don't function very well, very efficiently, accidentally, right? It takes a design to make them work well for the people who are participating in them. And so I think it's really important that that an effort is made to make these markets function well and to employ economic design, market design, information systems, incentives in order to ensure that those challenges of rising all boats can be met, and that this of the future can actually be achieved.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kathy, for talking today. It was great to discuss all this, and thank you again, everyone, for attending. There's a Q&A session, so if you have questions, please fire away, and Kathy and I will try to answer them. Thanks, everyone.